Welcome to Almost Senator en route. This is part 2 of the last leg of my trip. I went to the Museum of Flight, which was one of the highlights of my trips as well. And this is in the southern part of Seattle. And there is already a very big, nice looking constellation at the front. And in the inside, very famous planes, and the one I wanted to see was the 747 prototype, the one with the tail number RA.001, which was the first ever 747 which was produced. And very famous flights in the historic part of the museum as well. So there was the SR-71 Blackbird, so the fastest plane ever built. And there was also a model from the first cruise missile ever built. So the V2 from the Nazis, which was the cruise missile they used to bombard London, for example, and many other cities, of course. And one very special fact about that one is that it used a pulse jet engine. Coming into the big area of the museum, there is the B-47, the first jet bomber which Boeing produced, where they learned a lot about jet engines as a whole. It had six engines. We also can see here the DC-3, which is a very famous plane as well, still in use today after decades of operation. And then we can see the 747, of course, the prototype, the RA.001. We also can see the B-787, which is the first plane fully made out of composite material, which makes it a lot lighter compared to any other jets out there. So the 707, what we can see here, this in that particular case is the Air Force One, the first Air Force One, which was a B-707, so the first commercial jetliner from Boeing. And that one has its ancestors in the so-called Dash 80. And we can see here one photo from the museum in Washington at the Dulles Airport, which is the so-called Dash 80, the Boeing 367-80. And the name is derived from the Stratojet. And I have heard once, I'm not sure if that's true, that the code, the 3, was for the department for prop jets, or for prop planes. And jet planes were not out there, so the first jet airliner then was the 367-80, which later then was a bit modified and came out as 707, which first flew in 1957 and was introduced to the market in 1958. We can see here now the B-727, which was introduced in 1964, which has more or less the same body than the 707, but they mounted the engines at the back to enable the ground crew to operate or to load the plane without any additional gear. The 727 was also able to fly a lot slower, to land on smaller airports where they still used prop planes which are able to fly slower, and to align the 727 with other planes when landing on airports, on smaller airports. They needed to make the 727 in a way that it can fly a lot slower. Here we can see the 737, which was introduced in 1968, and it came after the 727. And the big difference here is that the 737 was a little smaller than the 727, but not too much. And there was a competition back then. Joe Sutter did. Joe Sutter was the chief engineer of the 747, but also was involved in other projects. And they had a competition internally if they should mount the engines at the back, same as at the 727, or under the wings. And back then they were undecisive, but they went for the engines under the wings as well, because it makes it a little easier to maintain the engines, and it had some other advantages, that the fuel does not need to be pumped up to the engines compared to planes where the engines are mounted at the back, and some other benefits as well. This is the very famous 747, so the Queen of the Skies, which was introduced in 1970. Joe Sutter was appointed to be the chief engineer of the 747, and back then it was not Boeing's highest priority to produce the B747. That was an agreement with Juan Trippe, who was CEO and founder of Pan Am and the former CEO of Boeing. So Pan Am wanted a very big plane, and Boeing wasn't sure to build something or construct something. But the CEOs agreed if Boeing built one, then Pan Am would buy one. And the other way around as well, if Pan Am wants to buy one, then Boeing would build one. And that's how it happened. And the 747 program was priority 4 on Boeing's list of planes. So back then they thought the future of passenger travel will be supersonic. So they were building the B2707 SST, and that was their highest priority. So everybody worked on that program. And in parallel back then, also the 727, the 737 were developed. So Joe Sutter, as chief engineer for the 747, had a hard time to get engineers work on his program on the 747. Once the 747 came out, all airlines who thought that they are big and they are important, they wanted 747s. And some of them did not really notice the size. And back then the biggest airplanes, they were the B707 and the Douglas DC-8. And compared to today, they had a capacity which is comparable to an A321 from today. So some 200 passengers, 170 to 200 something passengers. And that was the biggest planes back then. And the 747 could do double that. And so some airlines ordered the 747 and didn't really know about their size. So Sabena, for example, the Belgian airline back then, they ordered one in the late 60s, and their idea was to have a frequent flight connection to Congo, which was one of the Belgian colonies back then. But Congo then got independent, and Sabena had the order for these big 747s, and they could not fill it on other routes. So they agreed with Joe Sutter back then that they will build a combi aircraft. So that means in the front passengers and some freight at the back of the plane. And when they agreed that, they built a model, and a little later Boeing was at an air show, and they knew that KLM will come for an appointment, and they still had the model in the office for the combi for Sabena, and they did not want to sell that combi airplane to somebody else, so they hid it in the bathroom. And KLM came up and said that they are concerned if they could fill the big 747, So they again rolled out the Combi model from the bathroom and sold the KLM Combi, the 747 Combi to KLM. And many years later, back in 2000, when I had my first flight on a 747, that was a Combi. That was a KLM 747-400M, which was the code for the Combi, so the freighter and passenger combination. As my car is charging right now, I thought I record a 747 engine special here. So the 747, the first one, came out with a Pratt&Whitney engine with the JT9D. But back in the days it was unsure which engine should be used, and Joe Sutter, the chief engineer, had basically three different choices. So there was Rolls Royce on the one hand side. They already produced some engines for the 707, and Rolls Royce wanted to develop, or back then they developed a RB.211 engine for the Lockheed Tristar, the L-1011. And back then they wanted to use carbon fiber fan blades, and Joe Sutter did not believe that that would work out. And he was right, because the carbon fiber fan blades, they came out decades later. And back then the Rolls Royce had some troubles to develop that engine, the RB.211. So they went bankrupt, and the British government had to bail them out. So the engine was ready years later, which took some years, which brought some years of delay to deliver the Lockheed L-1011. So the first flight was in 1970 for the L-1011 Tristar, and it went into service 2 years later, so 2 years after the 747. Another option would have been General Electric's, the GE CF6 engine. And the CF6 engine was already proved to work on the Lockheed C5 Galaxy military transporter aircraft, but it was too less powerful for back in the days for the 747. Even though the 747 and the C5 Galaxy have about the same size and weight, the 747 is a little quicker. So it has a bit of a different shape for the wings, so it can go a bit faster than the C5 Galaxy, so it needs more powerful engines, and the CF6 engines back then were not capable enough to produce enough thrust. So Joe Sutter then, back in the days, voted for the JT9D from Pratt&Whitney. But these guys had some trouble as well, because the stator of the engines was not as static as it should be. So first engines, they had the problem that the stator bended when they accelerated, and they blew up some engines back then. But they desperately wanted to go to the Paris Air Show in 1970, and they knew which engines work well and which ones do not. So they picked 4 engines from the shelf where they knew that, or where they trusted that they would be good, mounted these on the aircraft which should go to Paris, and that's what they did. And Pratt&Whitney, back in the days, they did not believe that this is a major problem. One of the managers said, well, we produce engines for single engine aircraft, fighter jets, and well, they are fine as well to use these engines. And then the flight engineer back in the days, they invited some Pratt&Whitney guys to give them a demonstration. So the test pilot then invited them into the cockpit, and he toasted one of the engines, and that was apparently too much of a shock for the Pratt&Whitney guys, that they then started to develop or to improve the engine so that that one works better, or worked better than in the end.
The engines I mentioned before, the Rolls Royce RB.211 was an option later for the 747 when they improved and when they had more thrust, and also the GE CF6 engine was an option later. And back in the days, the CF6 was not only used on the C5 Galaxy, also the DC-10, so the Douglas Corporation with their DC-10 decided to go with the CF6 engine. And that the DC-10, the Lockheed L-1011 Tristar, and the 747s, they all were early day competitors for wide-body aircraft. And the first one which went into operation was in 1970, the 747 for Pan Am. Then 1 year later, the DC-10 went into service, and in 1972, the L-1011 Tristar went into operation.
After the Museum of Flight, I went to the Museum of Pop Culture, and I heard many years ago that there would be the original bridge from the Enterprise, from the original series. It was rather expensive, so they charged $30 admission, but I thought, well, it's worth it. And it is a very nice museum. It also looks very nice from the outside, but being there, I was looking for the bridge from the Enterprise and couldn't spot it. So I did some research, and well, that confirmed my poor preparation for some parts of the trip, because I figured out that that bridge is not in that museum anymore since 2018. So I was 5 years late. And that museum is very close to the Space Needle and the monorail. And I've been up to the Space Needle a couple of years ago and took a ride with the monorail as well a couple of years ago. But I always need to smile seeing that monorail, because that always reminds me on one of the Simpsons episodes where Homer Simpson was the monorail driver. I booked myself into an Airbnb in Washington State, and I thought it is close to Seattle. And well, I guess, I don't remember anymore, but I guess that I had a look on Google Maps how far it would be from Seattle. And looking on the traffic there, I guess I always looked at European daylight time, so at night time there, so traffic wasn't bad. But when I was there, I figured out that traffic is hell there. So from my Airbnb to Seattle, it always took me at least 2.5 hours, which was a strain in the end. So I drove 1,000 kilometers, some 600 miles in these 3 days where I have been up there. But the Airbnb itself was a very nice cabin, which was kind of strange, because I had the restroom and the outside in a separate house, kind of, and the shower house was again another building, and they had some goats there as well. So it was a farmer who rented out these cabins. My Airbnb host then invited me to his frequent Taco Tuesday party, and being there, I thought, how the hell did I maneuver myself into one of these situations again? When I arrived there, the host offered me some tacos. That's what I expected, and already started with opening a bottle of tequila. When the other guests arrived, every other party who arrived brought another bottle of tequila. So that was intense, and I guess I had a little too much tequila in too little time, so I departed rather early from that party. But I figured out that the party, that one took a lot longer, and I think they all got wasted. And it was not that bad than another situation a couple of years ago, which was the worst one, I would guess, where I got invited with my Persian friend to a racist's home. And I didn't know that he's a racist until 15 seconds or so after we have arrived, which was a very strange situation. I mean, a lot stranger for my buddy than for me, of course. Very uncomfortable. The good thing about having apartments is that you can cook on your own. And I got myself a breakfast every day when I was in that cabin to have some healthy stuff and not the stuff what you can get somewhere in a restaurant. So that was a very good benefit of having an Airbnb as well. Another day I took the ferry to get to Whidbey Island, which is one of the islands in the Puget Sound, which is the bay more or less in Seattle's proximity. And one day I thought about going to either Mount Rainier or to the beach, but well, I faced some challenges with electric vehicles, so I couldn't get a full charge overnight with the power outlet at my cabin. So well, I couldn't go to either of them because they both were 100 miles away and there were no fast chargers somewhere in that neighborhood. So well, that's the reason I did not go there. Instead of that, I went to Miller Sylvania State Park, which was very close to my Airbnb, and did a speed check there. On the last day, me being up there in the Pacific Northwest, I went to Olympia, which is the capital city of Washington State. And it was a very, very sleepy town, or at least when I was there, which was a bit of a surprise. But I can imagine in the proximity of Seattle, smaller cities having a hard time to kind of make themselves busy. So this is the Capitol building in Olympia, which is the capital city of Washington State. And don't mix that up with Washington DC. That's the capital city of the United States. Washington DC, Washington District of Columbia, which is, by the way, not a state on its own. So it's not one of the 50 states. It is District of Columbia. On the second last day, I already kind of prepared for my way home. So I went back to a Super 8 motel close to the airport for my departure on the next day, in order to avoid having a multi-hour drive to the airport in the morning or in the night. And being there, I paid a visit to Portland, Oregon, and treated myself with a maple bacon croissant, which is a kind of strange combination, at least from how it sounds, but it was really good. And as well, on the last day, I did some laundry to make myself busy, because I didn't want to do so much anymore, and avoiding a bit of extra work when I'm home again. When my laundry was in the dryer, I wandered around the neighborhood there, and I'm always making fun about these single-story businesses and these single-story buildings, because they kind of all look the same, and it could be a dentist's office, or a car shop or a lawyer's office. They all kind of look the same. That's kind of strange in these American suburb areas. Thank you for watching Almost Senator en route. If you liked the video, please hit the like button, and in order to stay in touch, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you and see you again.